There you are, ladies and gentlemen. Part 3 again. I repeat. But when I did the first part 3, I was no expert at lighting, I can assure you. Not that I am now even, but I didn't even turn the light on. Just one moment till I give myself the full Hollywood glare. Okay then. But number 3, the original number 3, was just not good. Or the information was wonderful, but the lighting, it was not good. But anyway, we live and we learn. So I'm doing it again. So there we are. Okay, now what I was trying to do in part 2 and what I continue to try to do in part 3 is to give you some background of the world into which in 1864 Tully ventured. Well, reluctantly I would have thought. I've just dealt with the tragedies of Mrs. Smearden and Mrs. Popkins and so on, and it was a fairly colourful world by that time insofar, the Mrs. Popkins and Mrs. Smearden were a little later than Tully's arrival, but nevertheless it was an interesting world. There were all sorts of people there. By 1864 you had the people who were running the cattle down the river, horses and so on, and certainly some sheep. And that would also have been true up the river and so on. And so you had those people, and then you had their workers, and you had the officials, and then various, malefactors of various kinds, thieves, the occasional highwaymen, horse thieves. They stole everything, whatever. And then, of course, there were the people who, it's difficult to know quite what they did apart from drinking non-stop and so on, but it was a colourful world, that's for sure. But it wasn't empty, that also certain. And so there we are. Well, what I will do now is spend a little bit of time talking about how they got there. Well, if you take the people who came up the river, they obviously came from the south. It was quite easy to get if you go to Fort Burke and places like that. Or maybe in good weather you could come across some Surat, I'm not quite sure. The route up the river for those people who followed up from Fort Burke was a fairly direct, well, it was certainly direct, and it was certainly rather more comfortable than those who were finding their livelihoods in the north. Nielsen, who, as I said, knew a fair bit about the southern area, we'll be kind and we'll say from the Neve and Yo-Yo south. He talked about the interest of the people in those southern areas along the river, in the southern trade, and because they got any wool they had would have gone down the river to Fort Burke. And certainly they were looking in that direction for their supplies. Now, for everybody, wherever they may have been, supplies were not a reliable thing, in that you never quite knew when you were getting them, and you not always knew exactly what you were getting when you did get them. Nielsen says that there was the steamer trade coming up the river to Fort Burke. Regular steamers, he mentioned, I think, at one stage, but the regular steamers only came twice a year. One came up from Echuca, and there was another one coming from a place that I think he called something like Goolwa, G-W-L-W-H. I think there's a place called Gowla, but where that is, whether it's in South Australia or wherever, I don't know, but maybe the Gowla that we talk about today was the Goolwa that he was talking about when he wrote. And so the reliability of the delivery of supplies was not certain, and so if you had 6 or 9 months' supplies in hand, you ordered ahead for the next 6 or 9 months because you really couldn't be sure when they were coming. And so the route to those southern areas, the areas below the, I suppose you'd say below Gowrie and going down to the border, was fairly direct, and so that was okay. But a lot of people, though, came to the northern areas. I would imagine they would be the areas north of the Neve and the Yo-Yo and so on, going right up to the Carnarvons and out that way. And their route in the very early days was rather more difficult. If they were coming from Brisbane, or if they were coming from the east, they couldn't go directly west to Charleville, or the site of Charleville, as we might do now, and certainly I just always assumed for years that's what they would have done, but of course I was quite mistaken, and therefore often confused. What they were reduced to doing in the very early years was they travelled out to Mitchell, or it was Mitchell Downs, I think it was called at the time, and they didn't continue direct west from there because between Mitchell and Charleville, the access to water supplies was always questionable, and in dry seasons, as there often were dry seasons, non-existent. So what they had to do was this: they'd come out as far as Mitchell Downs and they'd then get to the Maranoa River. They'd follow the Maranoa up to its headwaters, and then it was easy then to cross across to the headwaters of the Warrego. Then they would come down the Warrego to whatever location they had in that northern area, probably above the Neve or the Yo-Yo. They probably came down the western bank, I would have thought, but I would have thought that only because when the road system to those northern places, Augathella and then Karangarra, as you may know, Karangarra for a short while was the name of Tambo. When the road route to there was established, it was on the western bank. Cobb & Co took that route. They had the Cobb & Co coach station, I suppose you'd call it, at the 27 mile and so on. So that's why I think they came down the western side of the river, since I haven't read anything about that coming down the eastern side. So, but anyway, there they were, and there's a great colourful collection of people, and what did they want? Well, they obviously wanted trade, and so the ones in the south headed towards, or thought towards, Fort Burke, but the ones in the north, their most direct source of provisions was Rockhampton. So they could get to Rockhampton. There was about 300 miles distance from the very northern part, and if they wanted to go to Brisbane, then it was about 480 or something like that miles by that rather curious route, and particularly so in dry weather. And as I say, if you read what they were demanding in the newspapers, I mean, certainly they were complaining about, shortage of flour, shortage of tea, you name it, they were short so often. But they weren't so much complaining about that as observing that was one of the conditions of their life. Insofar as they were complaining about the things that the government might have provided but didn't provide. And one of the things that they were particularly concerned about getting first of all was a lockup. That's always the first thing, lockup. Because I think there's a fair bit of, there's a lot of thievery going on, but there was a fair few murders and axings and, you name it. It was colourful, I can tell you. But they wanted a lockup. That was the first thing. Then they also wanted a courthouse, because there's a whole lot of legal activities that had to go on in relation to land claims and so on. And so they wanted a courthouse also, and of course a post office. I think I read early in the piece that the Siemens had some sort of post office set up in about 1867, I think, but I'm not quite sure when the first postal service was established there, but there must have been one of some kind, because we know that, Churton in 1865, in early February probably, got a copy of the Brisbane Courier, and he seemed to get the Brisbane Courier regularly. So there was some sort of, I think, private postal service to start with. Then the government got involved in the Act later on. Excuse me, there I am. So it was certainly... Excuse me, look, you may think I'm rude, but I mean, I'm just old, and that's all there is to it. Old and decaying. And, You see, if you wanted to post a letter, you had something important. You obviously had to travel some distance sometimes to get to a post office or a postal route. And if you had any court involvement, well, that may have required several weeks of travelling to get to the nearest court. You know, it may have been Rome, it may have been wherever it may have been. And so life was a little bit difficult. Now, Charleville did have a lockup, you know, at one stage. I just came across, not very long ago, not a few minutes ago, I came across a description of that very lockup. They got something rather more handsome a little later on. Yes, here we are. He says, the shed now occupied by the constabulary and used as a lockup is a curiosity. It is partially roofed with grass, and as a consequence, the constables have to be furnished with umbrellas for indoor use. If the prisoner has no umbrella, he must weather it out, and so on. It was no mansion that they were living in. I don't know quite where that would have been. That might have been on around about allotment 4, I think. Wait, I'll just get the date of that. That was, that's 1868, my God, they're almost modern times. And that may still have been in an allotment 4 of section 1, but on that I cannot be sure. I'm no doubt I could look it up, but, you know, life passes on quickly, I can assure you. Okay then, so there we are. Now, as far as these mail services were concerned, if you go to Pew's Almanac, as I'm sure many of you will, you can start with the Pew's Almanacs of, 1864 and continue on. And Pew was very careful about listing the details of all of the mail routes in Queensland in those years, and they may make very interesting reading. And so, if you want to see the extent of the mail routes, particularly in that Charleville area, or that Warrego area, Pew is the place to go. So there we are. So that was sort of general travel, lock-up needs, court needs, post office needs, and so on. But of course you need officials for those, and I noticed that, this gaggle of officials, this great party of officials arrived in 1865. I can't remember the month, but I don't know, probably about the middle of 1865, I think, but it was like the Canterbury Tales. They all arrived. They told many tales on their trip out to the Warrego. Since I take it, that probably would have taken them 3 weeks or something like that to get there. So many tales will have been told. It was a big party. It had Chester, who was the Commissioner for Crown Lands, and something else. I can't remember what the other one was. Then I think there was someone else called the CPS, surely not the Clerk of Petty Sessions, but anyway, some, whatever. Then there was Police Inspector Lambert, remember, who, by the time the Chester survey took place, he had, I think, probably, it could have been allotment 2, but it could have been allotment 4, I'm not quite sure about that. Then there were several police lieutenants, Thornton being one of them, of whom I spoke in maybe part 2. So let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, half a dozen of them arrived, and it must have been a very grand caravan that arrived in 1865. So they were there ready for whatever action was coming their way in terms of the courts and the police and so on. Okay then. Now, there are plenty of people there. Okay then, as I say, they were a colourful lot. And there were, as I tell you, a number of descriptions of the town made by various people. There was one in 1866. That one sounded to me as if it was written by one of the Zemans. It was a very optimistic, from his point of view, an optimistic description. He said, look, a lot of people may think Charleville is a 1 week wonder, that it's going to be moved down the river to Mangalore. But no, he says, I really believe that it has a future. Well, of course, if it was one of the Zemans, he owned 3 of the 4 corner blocks in 1866. And, 1867, he owned 3 of the 4 corner blocks. But when he gave this description in 1866, his hotel at least had not been established. That was to come in, well, news of its coming were in March 1867. Okay. But he, though, described only 4 buildings at the time that he wrote. There was another description in 1868, and it too describes only 4 buildings, and probably the same 4 buildings as Zeeman will say, or whoever it was, described in 1866. But the description was made at a low point, because they said that the shop had been sold and the purchaser had disappeared, and the second pub, that's the Charleville pub, had been operating obviously since 1867, but it was empty. But that was true only for a couple of months. There was a very, very lean time in 1868, and the conditions of the time couldn't cope with, well, certainly as far as hotels are concerned, a superfluity of bedrooms, since both Janetsky and Zeeman had expanded the number of bedrooms in total in the town to, I think, about 13. Well, there was no call for 13 bedrooms, and so the Charleville closed up for a very short time. But even though it closed, and even though the purchaser of the shop had disappeared, there was still only 4 buildings, although out of town there was the Lands Department office. And that's where, well, I'll just check on that one.